The sound came first. Not shouting, not laughing. A scream, fractured and long. It tore through the late morning calm of the zoo, like something breaking loose from deep underground. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A stroller rolled forward and was yanked back instinctively. Somewhere behind the viewing deck, a child began to cry, not from understanding, but because fear travels faster than logic. Inside the gorilla enclosure, the silverback was no longer still. His name was Coda, and until that moment he had been known as difficult but manageable. Powerful, yes. Intimidating, certainly, but predictable. A creature of habit who tolerated crowds with indifference and keepers with wary respect. That morning, none of that mattered. Coda was on his feet, massive shoulders rising and falling, as if his body were bracing for impact. His fist struck the reinforced glass with a force that sent a low vibration through the metal railings and into the souls of everyone standing nearby. The glass held but barely. A deep, hollow sound echoed outward, not like anger, but like something slamming on a locked door. Zookeepers were already moving. They had rehearsed this. Agitation protocol, crowd control, visual barriers, calm voices, familiar gestures. All the steps meant to de-escalate a stressed gorilla before stress turned into danger. But this wasn't stress. This was urgency. Coda ignored every signal meant to soothe him. He didn't retreat to the back of the enclosure like he usually did when overwhelmed. He didn't posture for dominance. He didn't attempt to intimidate the other gorillas. He stayed at the glass. His eyes, normally observant, heavy-lidded, almost bored, were wide and fixed on something beyond the barrier. Not the crowd, not the keepers rushing in from the service corridor. One person. A senior keeper named Evan Brooks stood just past the safety railing, his radio forgotten in his hand. Evan had worked with Coda for years, long enough to know the difference between aggression and alarm, long enough to recognize when behavior didn't match the environment. He wasn't afraid of the gorilla, not yet, but something in Coda's stare made his chest tighten. It wasn't rage, it was fear. Coda struck the glass again harder, and then did something that made the nearest keeper freeze. He pointed, not vaguely, not erratically. One long finger pressed toward the viewing area, lifted then pressed again, as if the glass itself were the only thing preventing him from reaching something he desperately needed to reach. Back him up, someone said, voice tight. Give him space. Visitors were ushered away with practiced efficiency. The deck cleared fast the way it only does when people sense something is wrong, even if they don't understand why. But as the crowd dissolved, Coda did not calm down. He grew more focused, because Evan hadn't moved. Evan stepped back, a supervisor called. Now! Evan obeyed, taking a cautious step away from the railing. Coda's reaction was immediate. He roared, not the deep territorial bellow meant to assert dominance. This sound was broken strain edged with something closer to panic than power. He slammed his fist once more, then pointed again, tracking Evan's movement with unsettling precision. The enclosure fell silent except for Coda's breathing. No one spoke, because no one understood what they were seeing. They tried everything. Noise was reduced, sightlines were altered, enrichment items were introduced, objects meant to redirect attention and ground him in routine. Nothing worked. Coda refused to disengage. He refused to lie down. He refused to turn his back on Evan, even when Evan moved farther away, even when he disappeared briefly behind a service door. Coda waited. Rigid, alert, unmoving, as if calm were no longer an option, as if something were wrong and he was the only one who knew it. Veterinary staff arrived. Cameras were checked. Logs were pulled. Coda's vitals showed no signs of illness, no injury, no external trigger. His environment was unchanged, his routine intact. Everything on paper was normal, except him, and the longer the episode stretched on, the harder it became to ignore the pattern forming in plain sight. Coda did not react this way to loud crowds. He did not react to unfamiliar faces. He did not react to the keepers around him, now some of whom had raised him from adolescence. He reacted to one thing only. One person. Evan felt it before anyone said it out loud. A creeping unease settled beneath his ribs. Not fear exactly, something quieter. The kind of internal pressure that asks you to stop dismissing what you can't yet explain. He searched for answers. Had he changed something, missed a cue, ignored a signal earlier that morning, every logical possibility came up empty. Coda watched him the entire time, not with expectation, with urgency. Hours passed before Coda finally stepped away from the glass. Not because he had calmed down, but because Evan had been escorted completely out of the area. Only then did Coda's posture loosen just slightly. Only then did his breathing slow enough for the keepers to stand down. The incident was logged as an anomaly, a stress response, a one-off. But Evan couldn't shake the feeling that they had all gotten it wrong, because Coda hadn't been trying to calm down. He had been trying to do something else, and whatever it wasn't over. As Evan left the enclosure that day, the echo of the gorilla's roar still ringing in his ears, one thought followed him with a weight he couldn't yet name. What if that wasn't anger at all? What if it was a warning? Evan Brooks had always trusted patterns. They were the backbone of zoo work, the quiet mathematics behind care. Animals repeated themselves when they were healthy. They moved, ate, rested, and responded in rhythms that told you everything you needed to know if you paid close enough attention. Breaks in those rhythms meant stress. Sudden shifts meant something had changed. That belief had carried Evan through nearly 15 years of early mornings and long nights. It was why he had survived this job without becoming careless or sentimental. Patterns were reliable. Coda was breaking them. In the days after the incident, the enclosure returned to something resembling normal. Visitors filtered back. Noise rose and fell as it always did. The other gorillas resumed their routines. Officially, the episode had been classified as an acute stress response, likely triggered by environmental overstimulation. Unofficially, it lingered. Evan was reassigned temporarily, a decision framed as precaution rather than discipline. He understood the logic. Proximity had clearly been a factor. Distance, they hoped, would reset the dynamic. But Coda did not reset. He adapted. From the first morning Evan returned to the primate wing assigned to paperwork and peripheral duties, he felt it. Not in the way people talk about being watched, dramatic and immediate, but as a pressure that sharpened his awareness. Coda was tracking him. Not constantly, not obviously, but deliberately. Whenever Evan moved through the service corridors behind the enclosure, Coda shifted his position, not rushing the glass, not displaying agitation, simply adjusting, sitting where sight lines aligned, angling his body so one eye remained trained on Evan's location. It wasn't the behavior of a stressed animal. It was the behavior of a sentinel. Evan told himself not to read into it. Gorillas were observant. They noticed familiar keepers. Preference and recognition were well documented. Still, something about the precision unsettled him. Coda wasn't seeking interaction. He was monitoring. Other keepers noticed too, though no one spoke about it directly at first. Zoo staff were trained to avoid anthropomorphism, to resist assigning human motives to animal behavior. But silence has a way of accumulating meaning. "He's watching you again," a junior keeper murmured one afternoon, half smiling, as if to soften the comment. Evan forced a shrug. He watches everyone. The words sounded thin even to him, because Coda didn't watch everyone like this. When crowds gathered, Coda retreated. When unfamiliar staff entered the area, he showed mild interest at most. But when Evan passed, even at a distance, Coda's attention narrowed, eyes steady, posture alert, waiting. At first, Evan tried to treat it as coincidence. He altered his routes, swapped shifts, limited time near the enclosure beyond what was required. The changes made little difference. Coda adjusted with him, repositioning without urgency, without agitation. The watching continued. Evan found himself replaying the incident in fragments he couldn't quiet. The pointing, the roar that hadn't sounded like threat, the way Coda's focus had intensified when Evan moved away, not toward him. It had felt less like confrontation and more like refusal. As the days passed, Evan noticed changes in himself he couldn't easily explain. He dismissed them at first. Long shifts took their toll, and stress had a way of manifesting quietly. Still, the signs accumulated. He tired more easily. Not exhaustion, just a persistent heaviness that made his movements feel slightly delayed. Once or twice, he caught himself pressing a hand against his side without realizing he'd done it. A dull ache came and went, never sharp enough to demand attention, always present enough to register. He said nothing. Zoo work didn't leave much room for indulgence. Animals depended on consistency. Teams depended on reliability. You didn't bring vague discomfort to staff meetings. Coda, however, brought everything to Evan. One morning, Evan stood behind a barrier speaking with the veterinary director, reviewing routine health logs. Coda had been resting near the back of the enclosure, eyes half-lidded. The moment Evan shifted his weight, Coda rose. No sudden movement, no display, just a slow, deliberate approach to the front of the enclosure. He stopped short of the glass, sitting upright, his massive frame still and composed. The veterinarian followed Evan's gaze. "Is he always like this with you?" she asked quietly. Evan hesitated. "Not like this," he said. As if in response, Coda's shoulders relaxed slightly when Evan stepped closer into clearer view. The adjustment was subtle, barely perceptible, but it carried intention. That night, Evan lay awake longer than he should have, staring at the ceiling of his apartment. He replayed the moment again and again, trying to place the feeling it left behind. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, and that unsettled him more than aggression ever could. As weeks passed, the pattern sharpened. On days Evan felt fine, steady, focused. Coda remained calm, observant but unremarkable. On days when the heaviness returned, when Evan's thoughts felt slightly dulled, Coda's attention intensified. He paced then, slowly, methodically, not distressed but alert. Evan started to notice the timing. When Evan lingered late, pushing through fatigue, Coda stayed near the glass long past his usual resting hours. When Evan left early, citing paperwork or meetings, Coda settled more quickly. None of it proved anything. Together, it suggested too much. Evan began keeping quiet notes, not in official logs, but in a small notebook he carried out of habit. Dates, times, Coda's position, Evan's own condition. He didn't know why he was doing it, only that ignoring the correlation felt irresponsible. He had spent his career telling people to trust animal behavior over assumptions. Now that principle had turned uncomfortably inward. One afternoon, a behavioral specialist reviewed footage beside him, watching Coda adjust his posture as Evan crossed the frame. "He's not displaying threat," the specialist said after a moment. "No dominance cues, no agitation." "What is he displaying?" Evan asked. The man hesitated. "If I had to guess," he said, slowly, concern. The word landed with unexpected weight. Concern implied awareness, direction, intent. It implied that Coda was responding not to his environment, but to a change within a specific individual moving through it. Evan felt something tighten in his chest, not panic, but a quiet resolve forming beneath the uncertainty. If Coda was sensing something Evan hadn't yet recognized, then dismissing it wasn't caution. It was denial. Late one evening, as Evan prepared to leave, he paused near the enclosure one last time. Coda was seated watching him without tension, without urgency. Waiting. Their eyes met through the glass, and for the first time since the incident, Evan didn't feel unsettled by the attention. He felt responsible, because patterns once seen demand response, and whatever Coda had been trying to communicate without language, without explanation, it was no longer something Evan could pretend not to hear. The question was no longer why the gorilla wouldn't stop watching. The question was what he saw that no one else had yet named. Patterns don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as coincidence, tucked inside routines that feel familiar enough to ignore. Evan knew this better than most. He had built his entire career on noticing what others overlooked, subtle shifts in posture, pauses that lasted a second too long, behaviors that didn't break rules but bent them. That was why it unsettled him how long it had taken to admit what was happening. Coda's behavior was no longer an anomaly. It was a pattern. At first, Evan told himself he was overanalyzing. Stress had a way of sharpening perception until everything felt meaningful. He reminded himself of training manuals and peer-reviewed studies of the dangers of projecting intention where instinct alone might suffice. But patterns don't care what you want to believe. They persist. The data became impossible to dismiss. Footage reviewed from multiple angles across different days and shifts showed the same thing again and again. When Evan was not present, Coda behaved like a normal, well-adjusted silverback, resting, feeding, interacting minimally with the rest of the troop. No agitation, no pacing, no fixation. The moment Evan entered the perimeter, something changed. Not dramatically. That was the most unsettling part. Coda didn't roar. He didn't charge. He didn't beat his chest or test the glass. He simply became alert. His posture shifted. His gaze narrowed. His movements became deliberate, as if he were recalibrating to a stimulus only he could detect. Evan watched the footage with a growing sense of unease, seeing himself move through frames, while Coda's attention followed with unbroken continuity. It felt strange to witness it from the outside, to see how consistently the gorilla oriented himself toward Evan's position, even when barriers or walls partially obstructed the view. This wasn't attachment. It wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. Veterinary checks cleared Coda again. Physically, he was healthy. No pain responses, no neurological irregularities. Stress markers fluctuated only in relation to Evan's presence, then settled once he left. The conclusion no one wanted to voice hovered in the room like static. Coda was responding to something in Evan. Evan began to pay closer attention to his own body, not because anyone told him to, but because ignoring the possibility felt dishonest. He noticed how the heaviness he'd been dismissing came in waves. How some mornings he woke up already tired, as if sleep hadn't reached all the way through him. How certain movements, twisting, reaching, triggered a brief, sharp awareness that vanished as quickly as it came. Still, he said nothing. There was no language for this that didn't sound ridiculous. A zookeeper doesn't walk into a staff meeting and announce that a gorilla might be reacting to something unseen inside him. That kind of statement belonged in a superstition, not science. And yet science was struggling to explain the behavior in front of them. The pattern tightened its grip during Evan's absences. On days he was assigned elsewhere, Coda remained calm to the point of withdrawal. He ate, he rested. He showed no interest in the glass. It was as if the trigger for his vigilance simply didn't exist. When Evan returned, even from a distance, Coda's posture shifted almost immediately. Evan began to understand why that first day had unfolded the way it had. Why Coda hadn't responded to calming cues. Why space hadn't helped. Why calm had never been an option for him. From Coda's perspective, something was escalating, and time mattered. One afternoon, Evan stood beside a behavioral specialist as Coda approached the glass, eyes fixed, body still. The specialist observed quietly for a long moment before speaking. "He's not escalating," she said. "He's adapting." The words settled heavily. Adaptation implied learning, adjustment, response to feedback. It meant Coda wasn't reacting blindly. He was responding to changes, tracking them, refining his behavior as circumstances evolved. When Evan was removed from the area, Coda's agitation lessened, but his attention didn't disappear. He repositioned himself farther back, maintaining sightlines through reflections and partial views. Distance didn't break the pattern. It clarified it. Evan felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper with each passing day. He had spent his career advocating for listening to animals when their behavior didn't fit expectations. He had argued more than once that unexplained signals deserved investigation, not dismissal. Now that principle was aimed squarely at him. Late one evening, after most of the staff had left, Evan lingered near the enclosure longer than usual. The zoo was quieter, then the air cooler, the sounds softened by distance. Coda sat near the front, watching without urgency, waiting. Evan stood there, hands resting on the railing, and felt something shift inside him, not fear, not certainty, but resolve. If Coda was reacting to something before it became obvious, then ignoring it wasn't neutrality, it was negligence. The next day, Evan scheduled a medical appointment. He didn't tell anyone why. He framed it as routine, the kind of thing people put off until it became inconvenient not to. He almost canceled twice, embarrassed by how little he could articulate. No sharp pain, no dramatic symptoms. Just a sense that something wasn't aligning the way it should. The test began anyway. Blood work, imaging, follow-ups that multiplied faster than Evan expected. While he waited for results, he continued working, moving through his shifts with a heightened awareness that made every moment feel slightly heavier. Coda noticed immediately. The day Evan returned after the first round of tests, Coda positioned himself near the glass early. He didn't strike it. He didn't pace. He sat upright, his massive frame composed, his attention focused, watching. It felt different now, less frantic, more deliberate, as if the urgency had shifted shape, not disappeared. When the call finally came, Evan was alone in his apartment, the city quiet outside his window. The doctor's voice was calm, measured, and precise. Evan listened without interrupting, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles whitened. There was a mass, Small, early. The kind of thing easily missed without imaging. Not immediately life-threatening. Treatable. Real. Evan ended the call and stood there for a long time staring at nothing. His first emotion wasn't panic. It was recognition. Coda had reacted before machines, before charts, before language. The next day, Evan told his supervisor, then the veterinary director. The conversations were careful, deliberate, weighted, with the understanding that they were standing on unfamiliar ground. No one said it outright at first, but everyone understood. Coda had been warning him. When Evan returned to the enclosure after confirming the treatment plan, he didn't approach the glass. He stood where Coda could see him, heart racing, unsure what to expect. Coda rose slowly and approached. There was no agitation now, no insistence. He sat placing one hand against the barrier, not striking, not pointing, waiting. Evan felt something loosen in his chest, then a quiet release he hadn't realized he was holding back. The warning had been delivered, the message received. Coda had done his part. As Evan's treatment began, his absence from the zoo stretched longer than planned. Surgery, recovery, days measured in rest instead of routine. Through reports and footage, he followed Coda's behavior from a distance. Without Evan present, Coda settled. The pacing stopped. The vigilance eased. It was as if the storm he had sensed had finally moved on. When Evan returned months later, thinner and slower, the reunion was understated. Coda approached without urgency, without alarm. He sat a few feet from the glass, his gaze soft. Evan met his eyes and felt something close to gratitude settle in his bones. Not because the danger had vanished completely, but because it had been seen. Because someone without words, without certainty, had refused to look away long enough for it to matter. And once heard the pattern no longer demanded urgency. It had fulfilled its purpose. Evan didn't schedule the appointment because he was afraid. He scheduled it because ignoring the pattern had started to feel like lying to himself more than anyone else. For weeks after acknowledging what was happening with Coda, Evan tried to keep his life compartmentalized. Work stayed at the zoo. Unease stayed tucked behind routine. He told himself that naming the possibility was enough, that awareness alone counted as action. It didn't. Something had shifted the moment he accepted that Coda's behavior wasn't random. Once that door opened, pretending nothing was wrong became exhausting. Evan found himself paying attention in ways he hadn't before, not obsessively, but honestly. He noticed how often he woke up already tired, how certain movements triggered a brief, sharp pressure that vanished before he could place it, how he had begun to unconsciously favor one side of his body. None of it felt dramatic. That was the problem. Serious things, Evan was learning, rarely announced themselves. The first doctor's visit felt almost anticlimactic. Routine questions, routine vitals. Evan nearly laughed when the physician asked why he'd come in. "I don't know," he said, finally, hating how vague it sounded. "Something just feels off." The doctor nodded, not dismissive, not alarmed. Tests were ordered not urgently, but thoroughly. Blood work, imaging, follow-ups scheduled farther out than Evan liked. He left the clinic feeling foolish for having expected clarity. At the zoo, life continued. Coda noticed immediately. The day Evan returned after that first appointment, Coda was already near the glass when Evan entered the perimeter. He didn't strike it. He didn't pace. He didn't point. He sat upright, shoulders relaxed, his massive frame composed in a way that felt almost deliberate. Watching. It was different from before. The frantic edge was gone. Whatever urgency had driven Coda to slam the glass and roar had softened into something steadier. Not calm, but purpose. Evan stood at a distance longer than usual, unsettled by the thought that Coda might already know more than he did. He avoided eye contact not out of fear, but because meeting the gorilla's gaze felt like confirmation he wasn't ready for yet. The test results came in waves. One call led to another scan, a recommendation to speak with a specialist. Each step was framed carefully, cautiously, but the trajectory was clear enough to raise Evan's pulse every time his phone rang. He didn't tell anyone at work, not yet. The zoo thrived on routine and reliability. Evan didn't want to introduce uncertainty before he understood what it meant himself. But Coda understood something. Every day Evan waited, Coda positioned himself where he could see him, not close enough to alarm the staff, not far enough to disengage, His attention followed Evan through partial sight lines and reflections, through doors and railings, through moments when Evan would have sworn no one was watching. It didn't feel invasive. It felt concerned. The call came on a quiet Tuesday evening. Evan was alone in his apartment, standing at the kitchen counter with his phone on. Speaker the city dim beyond the windows. The doctor's voice was steady, practiced, and precise. There was a mass, small, early, easily missed without imaging. The kind of thing that often went undetected until it demanded attention on its own terms. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was real. Evan thanked the doctor, ended the call, and stood there without moving. His thoughts didn't race. He didn't panic. Instead, his mind replayed the past weeks in sharp, sudden clarity. Coda's refusal to calm down, the pointing, the tracking, the urgency that had made no sense at the time. The warning no one had wanted to hear had arrived long before the language existed to name it. The next day, Evan told his supervisor, then the veterinary director. The conversations were careful, measured, heavy, with the unspoken understanding that they were standing at the edge of something uncomfortable. No one said it outright at first, but the implication sat between them. Coda had reacted before machines, before reports, before certainty. When Evan returned to the enclosure after confirming his treatment plan, he didn't approach the glass the way he used to. He stood where Coda could see him, heart steady, breath slow. Coda rose and approached. There was no agitation now, no urgency. He sat near the barrier and placed one hand against it, not striking, not pointing. Just resting there as if the message had already been delivered and there was nothing left to insist on. Evan felt something loosen in his chest then. Not relief exactly, something quieter. Acceptance. The warning had been heard. Evan's treatment began quickly. Surgery, recovery. His world narrowed to schedules and rest, to days measured not by routines completed, but by strength slowly returning. He took medical leave from the zoo, his absence explained simply and without detail. Coda's behavior changed again. Without Evan present, he settled. The vigilance faded. The pacing stopped. He returned to his usual rhythms, interacting minimally, resting deeply. It was as if the storm he had sensed had finally passed. Evan followed updates through reports and footage, watching from afar as Coda reclaimed his stillness. There was comfort in that. Proof in a way that the gorilla hadn't been wrong, that whatever imbalance he'd detected was no longer escalating. When Evan returned months later, thinner and slower, the reunion was understated. No dramatic gestures, no urgency. Coda noticed him, immediately rose and approached the glass with calm deliberation. He sat a few feet away, gaze soft, unburdened. Evan met his eyes and felt something settle inside him. Not because the danger had vanished entirely, but because it had been acknowledged. The staff watched from a distance, silent. No one needed to explain what they were seeing. The warning no one wanted to hear had already done its work. It changed how the team spoke about behavior, not as something to control, but something to interpret with humility. It changed how they documented anomalies, not as problems to be corrected, but as signals worth respecting. It changed how they thought about intelligence, not as something expressed only through language or tools, but as awareness rooted in presence. For Evan, the lesson was personal and enduring. He had spent his life listening outward, trained to notice subtle changes in others. He had trusted instinct when it pointed away from him. He had never imagined it would turn inward, guided by a being who could not speak, could not explain, could only insist. Coda had refused to calm down because calm would have been dishonest. He had warned Evan in the only way he could. And in listening, truly listening, Evan had not only caught an illness early, he had learned what it meant to respect a warning before it learned how to ask politely. Evan never liked the way people summarized the story afterward. They say the gorilla saved him. It sounded neat, dramatic, as if one moment had rewritten everything that came after it, as if survival were a single event instead of a long, uneven process filled with waiting uncertainty and quiet work no one applauded. The truth was slower, and because it was slower, it carried more weight. Recovery did not feel heroic. It felt methodical. There were mornings Evan woke up convinced he felt normal, only to discover by afternoon that his body disagreed. There were nights when sleep refused to settle, and days when the world felt slightly tilted, as if balance were something he had to relearn rather than assume. What carried him through those stretches was not the idea of being rescued. It was the memory of being noticed. Coda had not intervened in the way people imagine. He hadn't acted out of loyalty or training or reward. He hadn't reached through the glass or performed some grand cinematic gesture. He had simply refused to ignore something that felt wrong. That distinction mattered. It reframed everything not as a miracle, but as responsibility fulfilled. Someone had seen what Evan could not yet see. And more importantly, someone had insisted long enough for it to matter. When Evan returned to work full-time, the zoo felt different, not in layout or routine, but in tone. The story traveled quietly among staff, stripped of spectacle, shared less as legend and more as lesson. People spoke more carefully about odd behavior. They watched longer before labeling something a problem. They paused where they used to rush. Coda noticed the change too. He did not greet Evan with the urgency of before. He did not repeat the gestures that had once unsettled everyone. When he saw Evan now, his response was measured. He would approach the glass sit and simply be there present without demand. Evan met that presence with something new. Trust. Coda's gaze no longer searched him. It rested. Whatever alarm he had carried had resolved, not because danger no longer existed in the world, but because the specific imbalance he had sensed had been addressed. The role Coda had taken on watcher, messenger, witness was no longer necessary, and he let it go. That more than anything changed how Evan understood what had happened. Coda did not cling to the moment. He did not seek acknowledgement or reassurance. He did not repeat the behavior once its purpose had passed. He returned fully to himself without lingering attachment to the crisis he had helped avert. That restraint was the final message. Animals are often credited with loyalty, but rarely with boundaries. Coda demonstrated both. He acted when action was required, then stepped back when it was not. He did not define himself by what he had done for Evan. He defined himself by knowing when to stop. Visitors occasionally commented on how calm Coda seemed, how grounded, how different he felt from other gorillas they had seen. Evan never corrected them. The truth didn't belong to the crowd. It belonged to the space between two beings who had shared a moment of urgency without language. On quiet mornings before the zoo opened, Evan would sometimes stand near the enclosure, the light filtering in just right, softening the edges of everything. Coda would sit where he always had, massive, and still his presence no longer charged with warning, but with continuity. Those moments taught Evan something he hadn't learned in any training manual. Care is not always gentle. Sometimes it is loud, uncomfortable, disruptive. Sometimes it refuses to be reasonable when reason would delay action. Coda had not tried to soothe anyone that day. He had not tried to reassure. He had insisted, and that insistence had saved time. The zoo eventually incorporated the incident into training, not as a miracle story, but as a case study in humility. New keepers were taught to document without dismissing, to question their assumptions, to respect behavior that did not fit neatly into categories. Coda was never singled out. His name never appeared in official manuals, but his influence did. Evan found himself slower to judge, quicker to listen, not just to animals, but to himself. He paid attention to signals he once brushed aside: fatigue, tension, that quiet internal voice asking for pause instead of endurance. He honored it now. Coda aged as all gorillas do. His movements grew more deliberate, his rest periods longer. Evan watched that process without anxiety. Some things did not need interpretation anymore. Some moments could simply be moments. When Coda eventually withdrew from the glass, more often, choosing quieter corners of the enclosure, Evan did not feel loss. He felt gratitude. Gratitude that the warning had arrived in time. Gratitude that it had been delivered without violence, without harm, without a single word. People would later summarize the story simply: a gorilla wouldn't calm down. A man went to the doctor. A life changed. But Evan knew the deeper truth. Coda had not been trying to frighten anyone. He had been trying to protect someone who did not yet know he needed it. He had acted without certainty, without proof, without assurance that anyone would understand. And when the message was finally heard, he stepped back into silence without asking to be remembered. That was what the gorilla had been trying to say all along. That calm is not always the goal. That warnings do not arrive politely. That sometimes the most important messages come from those who cannot explain themselves, only insist. And that listening, truly listening, can change the course of a life long before the danger learns how to introduce itself. In the end, this story was never really about a gorilla who refused to calm down. It was about what happens when we stop demanding reassurance and start respecting warning. Coda did not change Evan's life by performing a miracle. He didn't save him with strength, speed, or heroics. He saved him by refusing to participate in denial, by insisting again and again that something was wrong when everyone else was more comfortable believing everything was fine. That is an uncomfortable lesson, and that is exactly why it matters. We live in a culture that rewards calm. We praise composure, encourage endurance, and often mistake silence for strength. When something disrupts that calm, whether it's anxiety, pain, or an instinct we can't explain, we label it a problem to fix instead of a signal to understand. Coda shattered that habit. He showed that calm is not always wisdom, and urgency is not always danger. Sometimes urgency is truth arriving early. What makes this story powerful is not that an animal sensed illness, it's that a human chose to listen. Evan could have dismissed the behavior. He could have trusted protocol over perception, routine over intuition. No one would have blamed him. The evidence was subtle, the explanation uncomfortable, but he didn't look away. He allowed himself to be unsettled long enough to act. That choice, quiet, personal, uncelebrated, is what changed everything. This story also challenges how we define intelligence. Coda didn't diagnose. He didn't analyze. He didn't need language or proof. He noticed imbalance and responded with precision. His intelligence wasn't about solving a puzzle, it was about awareness, about reading what was changing before it became obvious. And just as importantly, knowing when to stop once the message had been received. That restraint matters. Coda did not cling to his role as protector. He didn't seek recognition or repeat the behavior once it was no longer needed. He stepped back into stillness. In doing so, he demonstrated something deeply human and deeply rare: care without control. There is a lesson there for all of us. How often do we ignore discomfort because it lacks certainty? How often do we tell ourselves to calm down instead of asking what our body or intuition might be trying to say? How often do we dismiss warnings because they arrive without explanation? This story reminds us that listening is not passive. It requires humility. It requires the courage to admit that insight can come from unexpected places and that not all wisdom arrives politely. It also reminds us why animal stories like this matter. Not because they shock us, not because they make us cry, but because they reorient us. They ask us to slow down, to look closer, to question assumptions about who notices, who understands, and who protects whom. They remind us that empathy and awareness are not exclusive to our species, and that sometimes the world warns us before we are ready to hear it. Evan didn't walk away believing in miracles. He walked away believing in responsibility, the responsibility to pay attention, to respect instinct, and to act before certainty makes the choice for us. That lesson extends far beyond the walls of a zoo. It applies to our health, our relationships, our work, and the quiet signals we so often silence in ourselves and others. Coda never needed words. He delivered his message with insistence, precision, and restraint. And because someone finally listened, a life changed course. If this story stayed with you, it's likely because it touched something universal, the hope that when something is wrong, someone will notice and care enough to insist. If you believe in stories that inspire compassion, deepen understanding, and remind us of the quiet intelligence that surrounds us, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing animal stories that don't rely on spectacle but on meaning. Thank you for listening, and thank you for choosing to pay attention.